So, my question for you is, have you ever had a plan completely collapse and you didn't know what to do?
Most every day.
Betty says every day. Your plan collapses and you don't know what to do. Twice a day for Donna. Anybody care to share an example of when a plan completely collapsed and you just didn't know what to do? What's that?
Sleep later.
Sleep later. Just hit snooze and go back to sleep. There was a recent New Yorker cartoon that said it was mistakes made between 7:30 and 7:55 in the morning. And it was about 8 catastrophic mistakes. Everything from getting out of bed was the first one. And then the next one was talking to his ex that he saw on the street. But it doesn't take much for your day to fall apart. Anybody want to share an example other than getting out of bed? Yes.
My daughter was supposed to get married on 4/4/2020.
Your daughter was supposed to get married on 4/4 of 2020.
And COVID hit.
And COVID hit.
And got postponed, and then again, and then we rescheduled it, got postponed again, and then it got postponed again.
Yeah.
So we finally did it, minimal people, masked, because, you know, the COVID, we didn't know how long it was going to last. And
Yeah.
she wanted to get married. So
Yeah. So she's married now.
she is married.
Good. Glad that worked out.
I got married in August after all that.
Yeah, I think the pandemic certainly was a change of plans for a lot of people. I think about folks who have an experience happen like what I saw last night watching it's been out for a while, but there's a series now called For All Mankind, which is on Apple TV, and it imagines the space race in the 1960s United States going forward, imagining things like, what if the Soviets got to the moon before the Americans? What happens to the space program? What happens if Ted Kennedy decides to skip the party in Chappaquiddick that weekend and then becomes a viable presidential candidate? All kinds of things like that. But there was a scene last night where a woman called her husband, who was an astronaut, and he was working in Florida. She was in Houston, and he was at the launch site in Florida. And while she's on the phone with him, she hears, he's in a hotel room, and she can hear someone else in the background. And it is what you think. You know, sometimes people say, it's not what you think. No, it's exactly what you think. And she then has to figure out what she's going to do with her life, because she's got 2 kids. She's married in a time when divorce was uncommon, and it was much less common, it started, but much less common for women to work, and certainly not common for women to be the sole breadwinner to support a family and all that. So she feels like she's got nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. She doesn't know what to do, and so she just starts taking everything that belongs to her husband and putting it out on the yard. It's like an impromptu garage sale. And her friend comes over and kind of has to talk her back and say, look, if you do this, you know, what are you going to do? There's really no other option for you. And there are moments like that where you feel like your life is on some track, and maybe you've been there. It can change in an instant. And for David, it's changed in an instant. Here he was, this faithful young shepherd. He was a dutiful younger brother with clearly this powerful sense of God's presence and reality in his life, so much so that when he goes to take food to his brothers, when they're fighting Goliath, the Philistine, he's not intimidated at all. This begins his political and military career after he defeats Goliath. He's on the inner circle of the king. He's married to the king's daughter. Everything looks great for him. And then it all falls apart. If you haven't listened to the podcast, 2nd episode of Anderson Cooper's new podcast. Anderson Cooper, obviously well known for his CNN exploits and reporting in Iraq, and his now hosting the New Year's Eve festivities every year. But Anderson Cooper is the son of Gloria Vanderbilt. So of Biltmore Estate and Vanderbilt Railroad Empire and all that. So he comes from this incredibly powerful and influential family. But he's also known great grief in his life. His older brother committed suicide when Anderson Cooper was 10 and his brother was 23. And his father died, I think Anderson Cooper was a teenager, but his father died when Anderson Cooper was 10. and his mother has recently died within the last 10 years or so. And so he's going through all the stuff in her apartment. He's going through her boxes, his brother's boxes, and his dad's boxes, because Gloria didn't want to go through any of it. And he's also finding all the notes that she left for him. He pulled out a skirt and sweater with a note, "This is what I was wearing the day your brother died." So she's leaving all these notes throughout the house, the apartment. So Anderson Cooper is doing a podcast where he's processing the grief, and he's talking to people about the grief who've also known grief. And so the second episode is him talking to Stephen Colbert. Stephen Colbert, who now is the host of The Tonight Show and was the host of The Colbert Report for many years. Anybody know who Stephen Colbert is? Yeah. And so Stephen Colbert was the young son of a large Catholic family. He is still a practicing and devout Catholic. His father and his two of his older brothers were killed on a plane crash on September 11th, when Stephen Colbert was 10 years old. So Anderson Cooper and Stephen Colbert are both talking about their grief. It's one of the rawest, most beautiful, touching conversations I've heard. If someone you know is going through grief, and who among us is not, I've talked to many people who have found some serious solace in it. But I know I went really heavy, really fast. I went from Martha and the Vandellas to this, but there isn't a person alive who's been around for a little while, who's not going through some sort of grief, and it's always there on some level. One of the biggest lies that the world tells you is that you get over grief. You don't. You learn how to live with it. You accept it, but it's always present in some way, shape, or form. And these men are talking about an experience of having their life being on a certain track, and they thought it was going a certain way, and then in an instant, it all changed. And I bring up all these difficult things because sometimes we see the Bible through these rose-colored glasses, these lenses that make us think of, sort of a sepia-toned drama of holy people having experiences, but they're so far removed from ours, we have a hard time entering emotionally into this experience. But the story that we're about to read, David, there was a question last week, was David already writing the Psalms when this took place? And I think we can say probably, or at least he was later reflecting on those experiences and putting them down in songs. The story we read today, he will say in Psalm 56 about this experience to God. He says, "You have kept count of my tossings," meaning me not sleeping at night. I'm tossing and turning. I can't sleep. "You have kept count of my tossings. You put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book?" So that's Psalm 56, which David writes about what we'll read today. So he is torn up inside. Like anybody whose life was going in one direction and then something happened and it immediately changed. And now he's alone. We saw him in his tearful goodbye with Jonathan last week. He is separated from his family. He is he's gone from being senior vice president with the office next to the corner office to now being essentially homeless. And he had to flee. So much so that you'll see that he has to ask for a sword or a spear. He has to find some sort of weapon, because here he is, the soldier that left so quickly. It's like leaving your house in the middle of the night and you don't have time to grab anything. So that's his experience. So if you can identify with that in any way, of having your life changed instantly, where you're in a difficult situation with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, or you just don't know what to do. You're off the map. You had a plan, and there were some steps you're going to take, and now you're off the map. There's no obvious next step. You're a senior in college. You're going to go to grad school next year, and then you find out you're pregnant. Or you are married, and you and your wife are starting out your life together as a family. You plan on having 10 kids, and you find out that you are having trouble conceiving a child. So all these sorts of things, you suddenly, the plan you had mapped out is gone. So that's where David is. So, I'd read the passage and see what David does and where God might be in this, although it's not going to be obvious. And I'll be interested to see what you all think about where God is in this story. So chapter 21, verses 1 through 15. It's the whole chapter. It's a short chapter, and there's a lot going on. So let me read it for you. Then David came to Nob, a city where to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech came to meet David trembling and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" And David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has charged me with a matter and said to me, 'Let no one know anything of the matter about which I send you and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place.' Now then," David says, "what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever is here." And the priest answered David, "I have no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have kept themselves from women." And David answered the priest, "Truly, women have been kept from us, as always when I go on an expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy?" So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord to be replaced by hot bread on the day it is taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. Then David said to Ahimelech, "Then have you not here a spear or a sword at hand? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste." And the priest said, "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you struck down in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is none but that here." And David said, "There is none like that. Give it to me." And David rose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, "Is not this David, the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s." And David took these words to heart, and was much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them, and pretended to be insane in their hands, and made marks on the doors of the gate, and let his spittle run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, "Behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen, that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?" Here ended the lesson. For how many of you I'm just curious, is this the first time you've read this particular story of David? Good. Some newcomers to the story. Good. It's a little weird. There's a lot going on. So what jumps out at you? What as you think about David in this state of being kind of a man on the run, fleeing, his whole life sort of falling apart, what strikes you as you read this passage?
He's a seriously quick thinker.
He's a quick thinker. Yeah. He's had to figure out where to go, where is he going to get some food, where's he going to get a weapon. Yeah.
Quick thinker, quick schemer, I don't know what.
Quick schemer. He's wily.
Yes,
Yeah.
very wily.
Yeah. What else? Donna's frowning. A lot.
I just don't understand why he would act crazy.
Why is he acting crazy?
So they'll take pity on him and not slice him.
Good question. Yeah.
It seems to me like right at the first, David is saying to Ahimelech that Saul sent him.
Mm-hmm.
So is he just out and out lying? Because I thought he was running away from him.
So Gail's question, he tells Ahimelech the priest, he tells the pastor that he's on business for the king. It is a lie. Yeah, don't lie to the preacher. But that's what David does. This man after God's own heart. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
He's also obviously very famous.
He's obviously very famous. Even the people in the city of Gath know who David is. And this is not a day where there's social media or even television where David's picture would have been put on. King Saul says David has, left the palace. If anybody sees him, please report his whereabouts. There's nothing. But they know who he is. His face is so famous even in those days. Yeah. What else struck you as odd or interesting or questions?
Well, holy bread seems.
Holy bread, yeah. What is this holy bread?
Yeah, a big deal.
Yeah. I mean, when I get hungry, I go into the church and that little tabernacle next to the altar and just eat the communion wafers. And so I can relate. No. Yeah, we'll talk about all this. All right, well, let's walk through it. So, verse 1, David came to Nob, or Nob, but probably pronounced Nob. This is, again, a time when there is no temple in Jerusalem. There's not really much of a Jerusalem. And so the worship of the Lord occurs in that tabernacle, this sort of movable tent, or some kind of structure that's not super permanent. There would be an altar there. And Shiloh, if you remember at the beginning of 1 Samuel, was where Yahweh was worshipped. It's where Samuel had his center of worship, of Yahweh. And it seems that, remember that whole thing with Saul's sons who were corrupt priests and they were struck down. There was an attack from the Philistines, and likely Shiloh was completely wiped off the face of the map. And so they've moved the center of worship, and they've moved it to the city of Nob. And so Ahimelech is there. Remember the beginning of the story. Hannah, who could not have a child, in chapter 1, went to Shiloh every year with her husband Elkanah, and Hannah said, "Please, Lord, please, Lord, please, Lord, give me a child. If you give me a child, I'll devote him to you forever." And the Lord hears Hannah's prayer. So that's how Samuel is born. And she gives Samuel to Eli the priest, and Eli raises Samuel there basically raises him in church. And Eli was the guy who was sort of a nice but out to lunch priest, and so his sons were able to do a lot of bad stuff. And so this is Eli's great grandson. And when David comes to Ahimelech, Ahimelech is scared and says, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" Ahimelech knows something is not right. Here's David showing up with some sort of small group. I mean, he's clearly got a few servants or somebody with him. He asked for 5 loaves of bread. So these loaves would have been bigger than, your basic Wonder Bread. They would have been kind of like large pita bread loaves, round loaves of bread. And he asked for 5. So, maybe he's got 5 in those days was sort of considered a round number because you got 5 fingers on your hand. It's easy to say, "Give me 5. So, does he have 10 guys with him? 3? We're not sure. But a small group of servants / soldiers are with him. So he sees him show up, and clearly he's unprepared. Normally when somebody from the king would show up, there would be some kind of pomp and circumstance. But if you remember, David was camping outside for at least 3 days while he's waiting for Jonathan to come out with the arrow shooting secret message about whether Saul wants to kill him or not. So he's been sleeping outside. He's got a few people. He sort of shows up out of nowhere. Usually if somebody who was the king's servant, the king's emissary, some sort of delegation was coming, you might get some warning beforehand. They might send a messenger to get ready or whatever. You'd be supposed to have some sort of feast. So here he is showing up out of nowhere. Think of him kind of dirty, out of breath, with this ragtag group of guys. And Ahimelech thinks something is maybe wrong. Why are you alone and no one with you? Usually maybe Saul would have been the main guy, and David would come along with him. He thinks something is up, and he's a little bit worried about what's going on. The other thing to know here is that Ahimelech has a brother, and that brother is the chaplain for King Saul. So Ahimelech may or may not be a safe person for David. David probably doesn't want to tell him everything that's going on, which is why, as Gail observed, he tells a lie. David lies. And we get 2 lies from David here. It's clear he's not a very good liar. I don't know what you think. A good lie often has some specificity to it to make it sound kind of believable. There's none of that here. It's the king has charged me with the matter. I can't tell you anything. It's secret. And I have an appointment with the young men, the servants, for such and such a place. So he lies to Ahimelech, and Ahimelech maybe is just sort of gullible. He goes along with it. Okay, that sounds reasonable. The king gave you a secret mission, and he gave you a secret mission but no supplies. Sure, that sounds credible, maybe. So David then asks him for bread, or whatever you have. And this is where we find out that he doesn't have any supplies. All he has are the bread of the presence, also called the showbread. And if you read in Exodus and Leviticus, it's basically every Sabbath, fresh bread, 12 loaves were baked, and fresh hot bread were put on this special golden table before the Lord. 12 loaves, a loaf for each tribe of Israel. This is symbolic bread. Like many things in Scripture, it doesn't actually explain what the bread specifically symbolized or what it meant or why it was there, but it was some sort of offering, maybe a way of putting the bread was representing the health, the harvest, the whatever of the 12 tribes, and so it's a way of symbolically placing these tribes before the Lord's presence, asking for his blessing. Some incense would be kind of sprinkled on the bread. And then at the end of the week, the bread would be eaten by the priests, and all the priests' kind of family and helpers or whatever, and then new bread would go on one of the perks of being a priest, week-old bread, every week. And so they've got some there, and it's only supposed to be eaten by the priests. But Ahimelech, again, seems to be a bit of a softy, and he agrees to give David the bread. On one condition. What is the condition for this holy bread?
They're all celibate.
They're all celibate. That's right. They have to be celibate. Now, these men, if they're fighting age, they're probably also married age, but there could have also been some extramarital activity among soldiers, which sometimes happened, even way back then. And he says, I'll give it to them if the men have kept themselves from women. Now, why is that an issue? Any ideas? Any Old Testament nerds here? Because it's not, God said he commanded people, be fruitful and multiply. Sex is not inherently, evil. What's the deal with the holy bread? Okay, I'll tell you. Purity, yes. And so coming into, if you were here way back when, 1,000,000 years ago, when I taught through the book of Leviticus, you may remember that there were certain things that would make you ritually unclean. These were not sinful things. It was just an understanding that you would be, for whatever reason, again, in the logic of the ancient Israelite understanding of religious ceremonies, a lot of it is lost to us, but if you had contact with a dead person, you were ceremonially unclean. If you had contact with a bodily fluid, you were ceremonially unclean. That means if you give birth, you would have to do some purification rites so that you could then return to the worshiping congregation, which is why Mary has to do this after Jesus is born, because she's ceremonially unclean. It's not sinful to give birth to the Son of God. But there was this understanding of uncleanness, and uncleanness is different from sinfulness. And again, even I, a religious person who gets paid for being religious, it's never fully explained what the thinking was or why. What was the difference between being sinful or being unclean? But certainly, being unclean came from illness, contact with death, contact with bodily fluids, and so sex is one of those things. You had contact with bodily fluids, and it would make you unclean. And so you'd have to go through some washing and some rituals before you could go to a holy place. War was often seen as sacred. especially since in the Israelite context, they were often fighting the Philistines, and they were seen as this instrument of divine judgment to get the Philistines out of the land that had been given to the Israelites. And so there was definitely this idea of holy war, and soldiers often kept themselves away from women during this time. You get a clear example of this later in 2 Samuel, in the story with David and Bathsheba, when David calls Uriah the Hittite home from battle. After David has impregnated Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, he calls Uriah home from battle, gets him plastered, hoping that he will go home and break his vow and sleep with his wife. So that then Bathsheba will be able to tell Uriah that it's his child, not the king's child. And Uriah refuses to do so. He does get drunk with the king, because you can't refuse the king when he has you eating with him. But he goes home and he sleeps on his doorstep so that he's not even tempted. And so, because this idea of keeping yourself clean as an instrument of the Lord to do this holy battle. That's the thinking that is surrounding this. And so that's why Ahimelech asks David, have the men kept themselves from women? Have they kept themselves clean in that respect? David answers, yeah, that's what I always do. Because again, we're in this holy war and all that. There's some nice Hebrew euphemism here. The vessels of the young men are holy. Now, does anybody have a different translation in verse 5?
In NIV, it says the things of the men.
The things of the men. Well done, NIV. Keeping it vague. Yeah. Yeah.
Aaron 9 says the food bags and utensils of the young men are clean.
The food bags and utensils, well, that is, you got to call your translator, because that is probably the worst translation I've ever heard. Because food bag is so specific and has clearly nothing to do with this context of have you had sex.
They weren't supposed to have any food.
Yeah, they didn't have any food. Yeah, that's right. So it's one word in Hebrew, which is why I also would take issue with that translation, because it's definitely not food bags. There's a word for food bags. It's so the word here, I mean, vessel is a good literal translation. Utensil is also a good literal translation of this word. But it's likely a euphemism for genitalia. He's saying the men have kept it clean. Weapon would be a translation, would be a legitimate translation as well. They've kept their weapons clean. But again, none of that makes any sense in the context of the question. Have the men kept themselves from women? Yes, our feed bags are clean. Like that does... No, it's our vessels are clean. And so... he says, the vessels of the young men on my journey, my soldiers always are celibate, even on an ordinary journey, an ordinary battle expedition. How much more today because of what we're doing here in your presence? We've come to the temple, or not the temple, the tabernacle. And so the priest gives him the holy bread, which is a bending of the rules, shall we say, because it's really only for the priests and the people who work with them in the tabernacle. Now, if you have a footnote, it probably mentions that Jesus refers to this passage, which is just a wonderful thing, knowing that Jesus knew the scriptures. He knew the Hebrew scriptures inside and out, backwards and forwards, because he kind of wrote them. And he references this passage in one of the big debates that he was always having with the Pharisees and other scribes and religious leaders in the day, because he was playing fast and loose with the Sabbath, always. All these rules of what you can and can't do on the Sabbath. And in Mark chapter 2, verse 26, he talks about how did not the priests give David and his men the showbread, the bread of the presence, this holy bread, even though it was against the rules? How much more important is it for me to break these rules about what can and can't be done on the Sabbath and heal people or feed people or whatever he was doing on the Sabbath? So Jesus uses this example as showing the importance of mercy over being sort of a strict letter of the law person. His mercy is more important. And here's an example. Now, if any of you know any atheist types that are sort of the angry atheist types that like to show and point out the conflicts in Scripture, This is one passage. Again, you have to have a real nerdy atheist. Most atheists are just people who are angry at God and have never read the scriptures. They just say, I don't believe, because one time a bad thing happened to me, and I can't really reconcile that with God, and so I'm an atheist. But you do every once in a while find the real nerdy atheists who get into the weeds. And a nerdy atheist who gets in the weeds might say, aha, here's one of those contradictions in Scripture, because we know here from 1 Samuel that Ahimelech was the priest that David was speaking with about getting the bread, and Jesus in Mark chapter 2, verse 26 says, in the days of Abiathar the priest, David got the showbread and gave it to his men. And they say, aha, see, that's why you can't trust it, because Jesus said it was Abiathar, so clearly the people who wrote it were making all kinds of mistakes, and we know it was Ahimelech the priest. Now, Abiathar is, anyone know who Abiathar is? He is the son of Ahimelech. And he would have been alive at this time, but clearly is not of age or hasn't grown up enough to have the priesthood passed to him yet. This is not a contradiction. This is not a problem. To say in the days of Abiathar the priest is sort of like saying during the era of the Tudor kings of England, or something like that. The term is prolepsis, and it's basically saying in those days, a little bit before, a little bit after. It's not a really specific reference. Abiathar was probably much more well known than Ahimelech, and so Jesus is referring to a certain time period in Israel's history by the name of a famous ruler during that time. You can tell your nerdy atheist to go pound sand. So moving on here, David gets the bread. He apparently is able to feed his men. And interestingly, the text in verse 6 explains to the reader what the deal of this bread is. That it's removed from the Lord to be replaced by hot bread on the day it's taken away. It may indicate that this is written, or this was a part added at a later point when ritual observance had kind of fallen off. There are times in Israel's history when they began to be less than faithful to the instructions that were given to them in the Pentateuch about rules they're supposed to follow, festivals they're supposed to observe. You have moments where, for example, they find the book of the law after the exile, and they have this national time of repentance and weeping before the Lord and all that, because they forgot all the rules they were supposed to be keeping, all the festivals they were supposed to follow, and all the things they weren't supposed to be eating, and all that sort of stuff. So the fact that the writer has to explain more about the bread indicates maybe there had been a time when they'd forgotten some stuff about the bread. Ahimelech gives them the bread, and we get in verse 7 this out of nowhere foreshadowing verse. It's just sort of dropped in there. Now, a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. It says nothing more about him. Why do you think that might be in here? Yes, David.
I read ahead.
You read ahead. So, but if you could, without giving it totally away, why do you think the writer's putting this here?
Being responsible for the death of all the priests, because he testifies.
So yeah,
about something later on.
he's eavesdropping. He's eavesdropping and he's eye-dropping. He's seeing David here with Ahimelech because Saul is looking for David. David is a wanted man. And so the text here is letting us know David thinks he's being really sneaky, but he doesn't notice that Doeg is there, and he just so happens to be the chief of Saul's herdsmen. Now, we don't know why he's there. It says he's detained before the Lord. It means he's probably there for multiple days, maybe to give praise to God for something, maybe to say sorry to God for something, but he's sort of stuck there. So that's why he's stuck. And David, unbeknownst to David, reveals more than he wants to somebody who's very close to Saul. Have you ever mistakenly forwarded an email? Or you replied all and you thought you were sending it to one person, but then everybody saw it? That's kind of what's happening here. David thinks he's being in secret, but the word's going to get out. So he's got the bread. Now he needs to get supplies, weapons. He says, you have a spear or a sword. This is like, the Lone Ranger leaving without his horse Silver and walking to some sort of place and saying, hey, do you have a horse I can borrow? It's like, you're the Lone Ranger. You're supposed to always have Silver. What's going on? And the only one he has, interestingly, is the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. And what are you going to ask, Donna?
If it was Goliath's sword, wouldn't that thing be massive?
It would be massive. Yeah.
For David to pick up and sling it around.
Yes. But clearly David's grown up. He's not the boy that he used to be. He's maybe a little bit bigger. And Goliath was probably somewhere around 7 feet tall. So that it was not like a medieval long sword. It was probably more of a, for Goliath, it would have been a dagger sort of situation. So for David, maybe more of a long sword. But yeah, it definitely would have been big and heavy. I love, though, that it's like behind the ephod.
Why is it there?
Well, that's a great question. And I love it because, as Donna Lees can tell you, or anybody in the Altar Guild at St. Albans Episcopal Church, or Altar Guild, or whatever you want to call it, in any denomination, the people who help get things ready, the behind the scenes for communion kind of stuff, there's always a closet just full of stuff. Like Stations of the Cross from 20 years ago that nobody wants to throw away. Or, one time for Advent, we did this thing, and we ordered a bunch of candles, and we just have now a bunch of pink candles back there. We've never used them since, but we're never going to throw anything away. So the Israelites, it's been years, and they still are holding on to this sword. And it's not like displayed. You could imagine it being in a display case.
Why is it in this town?
It's behind, well, so the thinking is, one, religious clergy types and altar guild types never throw anything away, number one. Number two, the sword was representative of God's great deliverance of the Israelites. So because Yahweh had done this great work, it seems like it would be appropriate to keep it in this holy place. Because you have all these things that show God's presence and his work through the Israelites. So in the Ark of the Covenant, it's got the tablets, it's got Moses' staff that budded, it's got all these things that are reminders of God's faithfulness to the people. And the sword would have been a reminder of God's faithfulness to the people. But clearly they never got around to making the plaque and getting it professionally, putting it in the shadow box. So he's going to get to it. It's on his list, but he's just stuck it behind the ephod, which is like some priestly garment. It's like a fancy breastplate, and they might have had more than one. So this is like an old one maybe, that again they've also not thrown away. And so the sword is just behind the ephod. So I think it's very humorous to me that's where it is. The other reason maybe they didn't want it to fall into the wrong hands or something like that. But I think most likely it's because this is a symbol of God defeating your enemies, and you kind of put it in a place where you can remember God's faithfulness. So he gives him the sword of Goliath the Philistine, I love David's little comment here. Yeah, there is none like that. That is a unique piece of weaponry. And the irony as well here is that sword has been used to threaten Saul in the past. And it's also used to threaten David. But now David has the sword, the weapon of the old enemy, and now he's the new enemy of Saul. So again, some poetic, ironic things going on here.
Wouldn't he have been able to claim that sword when he killed Goliath?
Could David have claimed that sword when he killed Goliath?
Yeah.
Yes, he could have, but it would ultimately have been up to the king.
Okay.
The other thing is David was a lot smaller back then, and we do know from that story that he was given armor, helmet, breastplate, sword, and he thought all of it was just too bulky and heavy, and he couldn't really move around in it very well, so he dropped all of that. So it seems like he probably would have been a guy that didn't really want it. So the next thing that happens, so he's got his food. So quick thinking, he got some food, and he got a sword, a really big sword. I don't know what his servants have. Maybe they're going to take turns with the sword. But they've gotten some supplies, and they got to move on. And David goes to Achish, the king of Gath. Now, Gath is a city; it's not a nation. So using the term king is sort of maybe a little bit of an inflated title here. If you know an entrepreneur who starts a business, and that person's the only employee of the business, but also the CEO, And they have this business card that says CEO. It sounds very impressive, but really they're just the CEO of themselves. And so King Gath, or King Achish of Gath, he's the boss of a city. He's a mayor that likes to use a much bigger title, basically. And the other thing, Achish, there's some scholars that believe that that is a title for king, like Pharaoh in Egypt is a king's title. It's not a name. So Achish might have been a name, might have been a title, but he goes there, and it seems like what he's trying to do, because he's broke, got no place to live. He's got some bread for today, but not much for tomorrow, and he needs a job. He needs to make ends meet. He's left his family behind. He maybe feels he needs to send something to them, and he apparently wants to be a mercenary. He wants to work for the king of Gath, probably because it's close to where Saul lived. He hasn't gone super far away, 10, 15 miles away. So if he needs to get back to his family, he can do so. Remember, he's from Bethlehem, which is near what's now Jerusalem, and none of these places are all that far from each other. If you've been to the Holy Land, you know this. And his parents, Jesse, and his mom are, we think, still alive at this point. So he kind of wants to stay a little bit near them. So he goes to Gath, and he says to the king, "I'll work for you." The servants recognize him immediately, and they say, "This guy's so famous, there's even songs about him. And this guy is dangerous. You don't want him in your house. He's your enemy. You're a Philistine. He's an Israelite. He's killed 10,000 Philistines. This is the fox in the hen house." And so now David sees, again, David wasn't really that great at lying the first time to Ahimelech, although Ahimelech was gullible and believed his lies. And now it seems he's not that good at passing himself off as some sort of incognito kind of person. But you sense this desperation. His whole world's falling apart. What do? You steal some bread, or you kind of borrow some bread from God. You borrow this old sword, and you try to start again. And now he's trying to work for the enemy. It just shows, again, this idea we have of David as this perfect religious guy. Here he is trying to hire himself out to the enemy of his own people. This is a traitorous act. This is Benedict Arnold kind of stuff. He's a hero to us, but not to the English, I'll tell you that. Or Edward Snowden, right, who releases all these American classified documents and now becomes the darling of Russia. He just was granted Russian citizenship. So, who were the Rosenbergs, the last people executed for espionage in the United States? Yeah. So here he is going to work for the enemy. He has knowledge of Saul's military equipment, strategy, all that, and he wants to go work for the king of Gath. That's how desperate he is. If you think of someone who has very strong principles, and everybody has their breaking point, and David clearly has reached his. And rather than do the honorable thing, maybe, yes, it's me, you discovered me, I will now accept the punishment. It's fair. Quick thinking, he decides to act like someone who has had a break with reality. And he clearly really goes deep into the method acting kind of situation. When you're a method actor, you inhabit the character always. You never break character. Daniel Day-Lewis is famous for doing this. He says, "I'm going to pretend to be a person who's lost his mind." But he doesn't just sort of say nonsensical things. He even, as it says, lets the spittle run down his beard, and he's making marks on the doors of the gate. He's, if you've ever seen, sometimes people who have had really difficult challenges with mental illness, you can see their journals, and at the end, the journals get very, the handwriting goes from neat and orderly to just kind of all over the page, and these scrawls. And that's what it seems like David is doing. I had a friend in college who had a psychotic break, and he went outside in the snow in bare feet and was yelling and kind of writing things in the snow, these messages. So David's clearly seen this, and maybe he's seen it in Saul, because remember, Saul has had some issues with mental health. But David goes all in a way that would cause him to lose any dignity. He's acting in a way that we would find shocking if we were watching it, because he really wants to convince Gath, the king of Gath, Achish, and this is there's all this talk about at various times in religious settings about the Lord is my God, I shall not be afraid. David here is scared. How interesting that the man who was bold and confident before Goliath, this little boy with his slingshot against this giant, now he's got the giant's sword, but he's so scared that he pretends to be someone who has completely lost his mind. He pretends to be someone who should be committed, who should be in a straitjacket, so that the king will think he's not a threat and let him go. Just save his own skin. So let me pause there. What are you thinking? What questions do you have? Yes?
I'm a little confused.
Okay.
David is here, the king of Gath. I thought Goliath was from Gath.
Goliath was with Gath, yeah.
So were these Philistines?
Yeah, he's gone into the enemy's headquarters. Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
you knew they were Philistines.
And he knew that, yes, he knew they were Philistines. He knew exactly what he was doing. Yeah, 100%. Linda, did you have a thought? No? Okay.
So Achish didn't recognize that was David, he just thought it was a madman, or did he know that it was David acting?
David, I don't know what he did, if he shaved his beard into a weird goatee or something and tried to sneak in, or kind of covered his face, something like that, dyed his hair. He's trying to pass himself off as just a random guy who's working as a mercenary, and they recognize him. And so now that he's been identified, he needs to get them to not kill him. And so that's why he pretends to be a madman. He pretends to be someone who's...
But if you wanted to run away from Saul, going to the Philistines would be a good place.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So again, as Julie identified, he's quick thinking and he's wily. And he's a little creative with sort of ethical norms. And you see that he's someone like many people today. Everybody is both sinner and saint at the same time, and David is that. Here he is, like, yes, my men have kept their vessels clean, myself included. So he is concerned about that, but he also is someone who lies. He lies to Ahimelech. He lies to the people in Gath, and he's got some real blind spots. What I think is amazing about this, so both Psalm 34, and then I'll wrap up with this, Psalm 34 and Psalm 56 both say, some of the Psalms indicate what they were written for, the occasion that led to their composition. And Psalm 34 and Psalm 56 are both written about this story. And in Psalm 34, David talks about God's faithfulness to him, and he was in a really difficult situation. And he writes this in Psalm 34, verse 13 and 14. Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. He tells people, basically, don't do as I do, but do as I say. So maybe he's feeling I shouldn't have done that, because as we'll see, David's read ahead, you'll see what happens in chapter 22 and onward as a result of this deceit. So he's saying, God's faithful, it's great, I was in a bad way, but you shouldn't lie. And he'll about to learn, we will all learn why that's the case. So a couple things, just kind of main points. Again, this story is a demonstration of what happens when you've gone off the map. You had a map, a plan for your life, what you thought God was directing you to do, and at some point you find yourself off the map with no instructions. And you're really at your wit's end. And David is at his wit's end. He's quick thinking, but he immediately starts kind of compromising values that he might have had. Like that shows, it's not to judge him, but to show the desperation that he was feeling. And again, to make this point that we've made before and we'll continue to make, that God is still at work, and that God can and does work through people that are making maybe not the best decisions, but are kind of at the end of the rope. And this place of feeling like you can't trust anyone, that you're all alone, and that you don't know what to do. This is a story of God being faithful even in those situations. And one of the things that I like about this story is that there's no place where David says, no place where the text is like, and David was up all night praying and then he decided what to do. Like there's none of that. It really feels like he's making these kind of off the cuff, shoot from the hip kind of decisions. Not all of them are great. It's a story that gives this robust view of God, who is not the pathetic being that we often make God to be, that he needs us to be on our knees in prayer for at least 5 hours a night or he can't help us. That he needs you to have perfect behavior all the time, perfect attendance, and never tell a lie like George Washington in order to work through your life. Here, David is clearly not an upstanding example of much of anything. And God is still at work. Even though it hasn't told us exactly how yet. And it's going to get a little bit worse before it gets better. So this continues to demonstrate God's power to work in people's lives. Yes, David.
And David is one of those kings, his heroes of the Bible, a man after God's own heart. What does he mess up on? This is a foreshadow of the sine wave, if you will, of his life with God going forward.
Yep. Yeah.
He's not sitting on top of the curve all the time.
Yeah, very much so. Well, I hope this has landed with you somewhere helpfully, that if you feel that you're in a difficult situation, you're off the map, you really don't know where to turn, you're thinking of going into St. Alban's church right now and stealing the bread there and eating it, or whatever the case. Donna says no, but talk to me. And maybe you feel like you're in a bad way, and maybe you feel like you're in a bad way because it's something you did. Like, I've not been good enough. This story shows, as much as any story in the scripture, that God's work in your life is not because of your good behavior. His absence from your life, perceived absence, is not because of your bad behavior. David feels very far from the Lord in this situation, but it doesn't mean God has forgotten him. David's behavior is not on the up and up, but it doesn't mean that God is done with him. God will and does and is working in your life apart from what you have done or not done. So I just want to leave you with that, and we'll say a prayer, and we'll see you again next week. Almighty God, thank you for this reminder of your faithfulness to us, even when we are making rash and hasty decisions, bad choices. You still are working in our lives, because your mercy is great, and it is new every morning. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.